of civil-military relations. And in that regard, let me commend to you a new book by our Professor Mac Owens, U.S. Civil-Military Relations After 9/11. I'm told the book will be in the bookstore shortly, so it's a new release, and Professor Owens has worked in this field for a number of years, and so I would commend his book to you and encourage you to read it. This afternoon, we're going to have a discussion with Colonel Milburn, Professor Cook, and Professor Kohn via Skype once again, and so I'll turn that over to Professor Cook.
Thank you, Tim. Dr. Kohn is going to be virtually present as he was this morning, but we've turned off the video because I think the bandwidth issues will be better if we just go with audio, and we've all seen his lovely face, so we can proceed without it. I wanted to frame the question in a couple of ways. I mean, let's think about the moral situation that all of you are in.
Not hearing you, Martin.
Sorry?
Breaking up.
I can't hear what you're saying. Breaking up.
I'm not hearing you. You're breaking up.
How's this? Steve, have we got the mic? Working okay?
Yeah.
All right. Are we okay now? Oh, is this you, Dick? Is this a voice from God? Who can't hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Let's make the call again.
All right, Dick, you on? Dick? Dick, are you there?
Yeah, it's very spotty. Very spotty.
Well, I don't think I can do anything to improve it, so we'll just have to proceed as best we can.
All right.
In just a minute, I'll give you a chance to make comments on Andrew's remarks, but let me set it up, all right?
All right, and you do that, and if we have to, I'll say some things through the telephone. You can relay them.
No, we can hear you. We can hear you fine, thank you.
All right.
Okay, as I started to say, there's an important moral tale to be told here for all of you, that all of us as adult human beings are autonomous moral individuals responsible for our moral choices. But all of you, like, for example, members of ordered clergy, have made an autonomous choice to cede some of your autonomy. Now, the question we're discussing here is precisely how much, but before we even get to that question, it might be worth briefly reflecting on why would a rational individual voluntarily choose to cede some of their moral autonomy. It seems to me there would be two basic reasons. One would be your trust and confidence in the institution to whom you are ceding that autonomy, that you believe in its goals, its purposes, and I presume you believe that in general what it's going to ask you to do, even if you don't entirely understand why it's asking you to do it, is at least morally acceptable. If you don't believe those things, then it seems to me a morally conscientious person cannot and should not voluntarily agree to serve such an institution. What I'm suggesting here is that since countries around the world vary in the degree to which they justify that kind of confidence in the institution, there's an important bit of moral reflection that all of us who choose to work for any government need to take seriously. And if we cease to have enough faith and confidence in those governments and those structures to justify our ongoing voluntary ceding of moral autonomy to them, we ought to seriously consider other options. So I would say that's an important thing to think about. The other question is why do you see the other reason why you cede the autonomy is because you believe that the functioning of the organization requires fairly direct and immediate obedience to orders. So there's a utilitarian reason as well as a sort of more idealistic one of the sort that I talked about. And normally in military discussion, this goes under the category of good order and discipline, that we need to know that every person down the chain of command is not rethinking every decision that's made, because that way lies uncertainty at least, if not chaos. These are just some relatively random thoughts I'm going to lay out here, by the way, kind of pearls without a string. Another one is a little bit autobiographical. Probably the first time I ever thought seriously about these questions was as a child, and I'm old now, so I can refer to a movie that came out sometime around 1960, I think, called 7 Days in May. I think I've mentioned I grew up in the Air Force. My father was a bomber pilot in Strategic Air Command, so SAC and nuclear weapons and the mission of SAC was a very real thing to me. I mean, I never lived in a civilian environment until I was 15. I was living on base with nuclear bombers taking off all the time. If you haven't seen 7 Days in May, you really should. It is one of the true classic films of around this question. And I was thinking about it as Andrew was talking this morning, because I wonder whether the general, the lead general, I've forgotten who the actor is who plays him in 7 Days in May, would come close to one of Andrew's categories. The story is that a weak, relatively unpopular liberal president has negotiated an arms reduction treaty with the Soviets, and the general officers believe that this is a suicidally stupid decision that the president has advocated. The treaty is probably going to be ratified, but the generals decide that this is such a threat to the safety of the country that a military coup is in order to prevent this from happening. And the story is quite dramatic. It sort of plays out as the president and one sort of intrepid, somewhat drunken senator try to get to the bottom of what this plot is. But I commend it to you because I think it was probably loosely based on MacArthur's problems with Truman, but it took that whole problem to a new level. So I think the question we want to talk about today has to be clarified on a couple of respects. I think some of the discussion this morning was confused between two different issues, resignation and retirement. Let me sharply distinguish these two questions. If a military officer were to resign, he would not wait for the due process of being discharged from service. He would put his rank on the table and walk out of the room and say, I'm gone. And that would mean at least giving up retirement pay and TRICARE for life and all other benefits that would accrue to a retired officer. It might entail further legal consequences for that officer. It's hard to know exactly how that would play out. But it would be a decision that this matter is so grave that I simply will not, under any circumstance, cooperate with it, and I'm willing to take whatever consequences come to me, knowing that for sure that some of them will be quite negative, like the loss of retirement and medical care. There's no tradition of doing this in the U.S. I can't think of a single example of anybody who ever did this in the U.S. military. There are examples in other militaries, by the way, but not in ours. What we actually have is a tradition of retiring and simply saying to your boss, whoever it was, I don't feel that I can in confidence carry out this plan, or I think you've lost confidence in me. Probably the most visible example of this, and actually Dick Kohn was able finally to write an article about it, was the early retirement of General Fogelman, who was Chief of Staff of the Air Force, a very popular Chief of Staff under Secretary Cohen. And I had the privilege of interviewing General Fogelman about this once, and he didn't talk about it for a long time. I think Dick talked him into talking about it because people were speculating so much about why did General Fogelman suddenly go away that Dick persuaded him that he'd better tell the story the way he wants it told because other people were going to fill in the empty space. And the story that he told was a very simple one. There were a number of major issues inside the Air Force. You remember the Kelly Flynn case, the B-52 pilot who was having sex with the husband of her crew chief, I believe it was, or something like that, and several other internal Air Force decisions like that on which the Secretary had overruled General Fogelman. And his response was, well, you clearly don't trust my judgment to run my own service, and that's fine, that's your privilege. But if that is the case, then probably I should go, and you should get somebody whose judgment you do fully respect. So that's one case. He didn't make a big stink out of it. He went quietly into the night. It was not a case where he thought Cohen was doing anything immoral or unethical or giving illegal orders and so forth. The other one that interests me, and Andrew and I were talking a little about this over lunch, is General Newbold, Marine General Newbold, who was on the Joint Staff doing the planning for the Iraq War, who apparently concluded that the war plan was so bad that he didn't want to be there when it was executed. And he, too, retired early and went quietly and said nothing about it for a couple of years until the so-called revolt of the generals, when the 6 generals, somewhat independently of each other, all called for the resignation of Secretary Rumsfeld. And General Newbold says the reason that he went public when he did is he went to the burn unit at Brooks and he saw the human consequences of the war and felt that somehow this was on his conscience for not doing what he could have done to stop it. And one question I think he still struggles with is, should he immediately upon retirement, say, have hit the Sunday talk shows and said, I've seen the war plan, I don't think we should execute it? And if so, would that have been a story for more than 15 minutes in the news cycle? Because after all, there were other very senior retired Marine generals like Zinni, who'd come out of CENTCOM, saying there's absolutely no reason for this war. I mean, we can contain Saddam Hussein. I was doing it myself not very long ago. So it wasn't as if we didn't have people who had been in command of the region saying clearly that they thought that this was a bad idea, and was not slowing it down at all. Now, and this is the last random remark I'm going to make, I think part of what Colonel Milburn's worried about is something I think all of us should be worried about, which is the constitutional mechanism for deciding to use military force in the United States, as we talked about yesterday, is very, very badly broken. I mean, the Congress was essentially supine through this, as it has been through almost every use of force decision since Vietnam. The press seems to have lost its critical edge almost entirely, which would have normally been another check and balance. And the American people were very, very afraid, and understandably so. And so rallying around the flag and the leader, and when people are very scared, is a natural thing to happen. So the ordinary ways that the public debate about the wisdom of what we were doing this ought to work didn't work very well. And there's not much reason to think it'll work better the next time, given the last few histories. So I think Colonel Milburn almost suggested places that because the system is so broken, the military needs to fill the void, right? It has to be almost a fourth branch of government to provide a check and balance because the other checks and balances aren't there. I'm not unsympathetic to his point about the state of the use of constitutional processes to make these decisions. But I have to say I'd be very nervous about suggesting that it would be the job of the military to fill that void. That's a political problem for all of us, I think. So those are some random thoughts to maybe frame the conversation. Dick Cohn's online, and he had some responses. He was able to hear most of Colonel Milburn's speech. So, Dick, I'm going to let you make a few comments and let Colonel Milburn respond, and then we'll go to questions and answers, okay? Okay, Dick, you there?
Thank you, Martin. I would just add to your very good comments that the system was broken a year after the Constitution was ratified, when George Washington took the country into a war with the Indians in the Northwest. And some people in the Congress didn't object because of Washington's prominence. But it's been broken a long time. We've only declared war in this country 5 times in our entire history, and there was a debate before the Persian Gulf War in the Congress, a debate after 9/11, and a debate before the Iraq War. So I don't think it's quite as broken as you suggest, and I make that comment as a historian. But let me make a few remarks about what Colonel Milburn said. I think I heard most of it. He started out by saying that he certainly had no intention to call into question civilian control, or he did make the comment that he thought his article was being misread, and I think that's always the last offense of somebody who regrets some of the things they said. I don't really care about his intentions because the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I care about what he wrote, and I'm going to read just the first few sentences of his articles to remind people what he wrote. There are circumstances under which a military officer is not only justified but also obligated to disobey a legal order. That's his first sentence. In supporting this assertion, I discuss where the tipping point lies between the military officer's customary obligation to obey and his moral obligation to dissent. Now here he's conflated disobeying a legal order with dissenting. Now, his third sentence says, this topic defies black and white specificity, but is nevertheless fundamental to an understanding of the military professional's role in the execution of policy. Now we're talking about a third thing, which is the execution of policy. And then the fourth sentence says, it involves complex issues, among them the question of balance between strategy and policy, and between military leaders and their civilian masters. So he is talking about policy, and no amount of hemming and hawing will allow him to escape that. Now I note that Colonel Milburn is a graduate in philosophy and a graduate in law. He has to know his choice of words. If he had used the word disagreement in his article and in the title, we wouldn't be having a lot of this discussion, but he used the word dissent, which means that after you've had the discussion, you are not going to be in favor of this, and in fact, you are going to oppose it. He says he's not in favor of the military making policy or overriding policy. But we know perfectly well that if a senior military officer refuses a legal order at the highest level, he is making or she is making policy by stopping a policy. And he cites Sir Michael Jackson, who in fact refusing his order was making a political and foreign policy judgment. And so you can't skip this point. Now, on the subject of moral autonomy, he conflates the profession's moral autonomy with an individual's moral autonomy, and he did not quote me fully. Of course, all officers have a certain degree of moral autonomy. As Martin has pointed out, the question is, does a profession have moral autonomy? And I don't think a profession has that kind of autonomy, particularly the military profession, which is under civil authority in the Constitution and in law. And I don't think, as a lawyer, Colonel Milburn would really want every officer to be his own interpreter of the U.S. Constitution. For one thing, it would put lawyers out of business, judges too, but indeed, in none of his remarks, and I don't believe in his article, although I didn't read it all over again, does he ever mention the Uniform Code of Military Justice? That has a role to play in this discussion. So I would say that Colonel Milburn is responsible for what he wrote. I've said the same thing to my former master's PhD student, now Brigadier General McMaster, who has been misinterpreted. General McMaster has chosen not to come before forum as Colonel Milburn has, and I commend him for his willingness to come and defend what I think is an indefensible set of arguments and an indefensible article. I don't think that if you believe the military should not be politicized and it should not be making policy, that you want to allow the military, encourage the military to arrogate to itself a certain amount of decision-making, and particularly to talk about disobeying legal orders. And to cite in his remarks before lunch the Nuremberg case, I think, really irresponsible, because he says in his article that he's not going to talk about illegal orders. So I don't think that if you in the audience, have read his article and have listened to this and go away from this conference, and you really believe what Colonel Milburn apparently believes, certainly what he's written, I think you would want to take the Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, and you would want to say, always faithful, except, it's complicated. And I just don't think that's helpful to the order and discipline of the U.S. Armed Forces. I must say, in the end, I value what Colonel Milburn has done in a it's a backhanded compliment, I'm afraid, because I don't think his arguments are very persuasive. And so what he's done is he's in a terribly incendiary point, and he's argued it poorly enough so that maybe we can put it to bed. And I'm glad it's been brought up, because I think a lot of officers are sympathetic to the thoughts. So that's all I want to say, and so thank you for your patience.
Thanks, Dick. I'd like to encourage you not to hold back.
Never been known to, Martin.
I have a question before I turn it over to Andy. We had Don Snyder up here yesterday, and we were talking a lot about the meaning of being a profession in the sociological sense of the term. Are you hearing me all right?
I am indeed.
Okay. And as you well know, a number of the things people point out about true professions is that they have a high degree of autonomy, that they have their own internal code of ethics and behavior. So, for example, one of the things you would expect of an ethical attorney or a physician, even if they worked in the middle of a complex bureaucracy, is there are things that their superiors could tell them to do which they simply could not do in a way that would be compatible with that professional self-understanding. That's point one, and I'd like to hear you talk about it. So the military is a profession, but it's somehow different than those other professions? If so, tell me how. And then the second point is, I think the most interesting kind of case would be where an officer has been asked for professional military judgment, and they've been told by a superior to do something which, in their very best professional judgment, is clearly, as a physician would say, contraindicated. It's not what a professional would do in this kind of circumstance. So it's not just a question of I don't like the policy, but that I have years of professional expertise and training, and I'm now in a situation where you're asking me to apply it, and I'm being overruled and told to do something which in my professional judgment is fundamentally wrong-headed.
Well, your first part, there's no question that all professions differ. Some are licensed by the state, but the military profession works directly for the state, and thus any autonomy it possesses is delegated. And so I think it's often misleading to talk about the military having autonomy. What the military has is authority over its own activity that's delegated, but that delegation is always tentative and is very much open-ended because the civilians can intervene at any point, and as Abraham Lincoln did, and actually order into action as they did in Norfolk in 1862. So let's be very careful, and I've talked to Don many years over these kinds of things. Autonomy is a misleading term when applied to the military, which operates under civilian control, very clearly under a law. You know, the lawyers and doctors do too, to some extent, but not near to the same extent. Now, on the judgment question, I think a military officer is obligated to state his or her opinion that this is the wrong thing to do and will result in a disaster, and he'd really rather not do it. But once that obligation is fulfilled and it's a legal order and it comes from a constituted superior, I don't think in most every instance there is much of a choice. And I'll tell you a story about one of the most famous air battles in World War II. One of the four colonels, Jacob Smart of West Point, 1931, brought up this idea on Hap Arnold's staff that they should go in and knock out the Ploiesti oil fields with a low-level bomber raid, because they could knock it out, they'd surprise them, and it would be a great thing to do. And so Hap Arnold said to him, "Well, Jake, you thought this up. You've gone over there to North Africa and you convinced these people to do it." So Colonel Smart went over to North Africa, and he made his briefing, and he said what would happen. And there was a group commander there by the name of Leon Johnson, who was West Point 26. And Leon Johnson, a bomber commander, B-24 commander, said, "I don't think this is going to work. We're going to get shot to hell. We're all going to get shot down. It's not going to work. We're going to lose a lot of people. We can't afford to lose a lot of people in airplanes." And that's it. And Leon Johnson told me he made his case. The order was given. He flew the mission and won the Medal of Honor. But I said, well, I was sitting talking about this with four-star retired Johnson and four-star retired Smart. And I said to General Johnson, why didn't you refuse to go? And he looked at me, he said, 1943, a fight to the death with the Germans? I'm going to refuse to lead my group in battle? What are you, crazy? He didn't say that, but he said, that just never occurred to me. And so, what are you going to make the distinction? It's not an important thing. It's not a big deal. We're in a little war, not a big war. The country's not at risk, and so forth and so on. I'm sorry. Orders are orders. Legal orders are legal orders. I don't care whether you're the chairman of the Joint Chief, or a combatant commander, or the captain of a ship. You have your obligations.
Okay, thanks very much, Dick. Colonel Milburn.
Yeah, Dr. Cohen, very glib, but I think you missed my point again. One thing I was saying about policy, there's a difference, clearly a difference between opposing. Am I going through this?
Here, you don't have to hold it. Oh, there.
I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
There's clearly a difference between opposing policy for the sake of the policy itself, and opposing policy because you believe that it's going to result in institutional damage, excuse me, to the nation or to your subordinates. So what I'm talking about is, yes, it lies within the realm of policy. A decision may lie within the realm of policy, and because of the interconnectedness, it's impossible to distinguish. But that does not, by any means, prevent you from making that call, subjective subjective as though it may appear.
And
I actually said that as I was talking through. I don't know if you actually sorry. I don't know if you actually heard that, but I made that distinction. I agree it's not an easy distinction, but I think part of the problem, and one of the students brought this up with your argument up front, is you want to reduce everything to absolutes. I'm saying you just can't do that.
Colonel Milburn, though, if you're leaving these things indistinct and uncertain, isn't this an invitation to chaos? Isn't this an invitation to misinterpretation? You have tens of thousands of officers.
Yeah, and that's why I said that's one of the problems. You can't codify some of these areas, and I think that's where you have to leave this down to the profession. I know that for you that's absolute anathema. But I'm saying when we talk about self-regulation in the profession, that's one of the things we have to come down to. This isn't about codifying things. It's about training our officers into this way of thinking, understanding not everything is black and white. I thought the example I gave about Jackson was a good one, because here's a guy, you would accuse him undoubtedly of having been wrong in that decision, but here's a guy 40 years, and he's made one decision to disobey an order. So my point here is that I don't think that your argument that this is a slippery slope, and that once we allow this, and we're going to see strategic level leaders resign simply because they want to change a policy. There are a number of safeguards in the system to prevent that happening.
I'm curious, Colonel Milburn, with General Jackson, it seems to me that part of the reason that played out the way it did was because it was a coalition operation, that you had a British commander working for an American commander, right? Had Jackson been an American, do you think that would have been viewed the same way?
No way of telling, but that's a very good point.
Yeah.
It could also, and I don't mean to muddy the waters, but he could well have believed that the NAC would subsequently back him up.
Right, okay. All right, I think at this point, if it's agreeable to you, Dick, Tim Demme will come up and chair the Q&A session, and please feel free to ask your question. I'll have to repeat them for Dick, so please don't give me really long, complicated questions if you can, at least if they're directed at him.
Great. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you, sir. Lieutenant Commander Justin Pollard, sir, I apologize. I have a long question because I have all plugs to it.
Does your microphone work?
It does not.
Okay.
I would say the constitutionality of action, presidential actions, like the use of force without Congress's approval, I would say that's ambiguous. And however, the Constitution clearly designates the Supreme Court as the only body that can interpret the Constitution. I would say that your assertion that those officers' allegiance to the Constitution overrides that to any elected official means that military officers themselves will have to interpret the Constitution. And I would say, don't you worry that emphasis sets a dangerous precedent that would either lead to military down the road, slippery slope, either openly rebel, or worse yet, remove elected officials that they consider to be acting in an unconstitutional manner.
Let me repeat the question for Dick. Dick, the question is, if officers' loyalty is to the Constitution, does that then mean that they individually have the right or even the responsibility to interpret the Constitution? The questioner says, well, really that power resides only with the Supreme Court, and we certainly don't want a situation where every officer is making that independent determination. Is that a fair summary of your question? Now, I would just give you one quick question from back to the good old days when I was in college. When President Nixon resigned, believe it or not, there was a lot of speculation in the country. What would happen if the president decided to order the military to defend him in the White House and he refused to leave? And if he had a commander who received that order from the commander-in-chief. Right? I assume in that case you would want to say that battalion commander, brigade commander probably could make the constitutional determination that I'm not doing that if the president had in fact been not only impeached but voted out of office.
Sir, if he was impeached, though, as an act of Congress, the president could say, to keep himself, use military to keep himself in power would be an unlawful order.
Good, okay.
Operating against Congress.
Right. But it would require the officer to understand the Constitution to make that determination, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay.
He wouldn't be interpreting the Constitution.
Good point. Any thoughts about Dick or Andy?
Go ahead, Colonel Milburn. You're the one that's on the hook with this one. I'll just add a
No, actually, we were discussing this in break, and it's not an easy question. Suppose, to use an example, suppose, for the sake of argument, that the executive suspended habeas corpus for the example that I used. And your point is, well, are we asking our military officers to interpret the Constitution, which is actually the role of the Supreme Court? And I don't have an easy answer for you. I can say that something like that was probably a reasonable man would say that it was a relatively obvious case, and an officer would have been justified in disobeying on those grounds.
Did I understand your example, Andrew, that you didn't say it in so many words, but I got the sense you were referring to the Japanese internment order, right?
No.
Or you're referring to Lincoln's suspension of
No, the detainee decision.
The detainee decision. Okay.
Executive authority to suspend, or executive order to suspend habeas corpus.
How about we go with, I think the even more interesting example is the Japanese internment order, right? Because these are fellow citizens, right? Would you care to comment on, you're the guy who's ordered to start rounding up Japanese and?
I can't tell you. I can't tell you what I do in that situation. I would say, I don't know. I can't tell you what I would do.
Yeah.
How about obeying orders?
Wow. I have a little more experience in that than you.
Let me add-
That's a fascinating problem, I think, to think about.
It is, and so I'm not giving you, hey, I would oppose it. I don't know, but I'd be obligated to, to at least consider dissent.
Thank you.
Well, you know,
Question?
that's a subject that's, years ago, that was taught as a case study at the Naval Academy. And I was there, and I was quite surprised, and I must have disturbed by that, because that order, the executive order to intern Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals on the West Coast, it's only on the West Coast, by the way, was very much favored by the Attorney General of California, whose name was Earl Warren, very much favored by the military. John DeWitt, the commander out there, very much favored by the public. And when it finally went to the Supreme Court in the Korematsu case in 1944, it was upheld by a 5-4 decision. So I think that for a lieutenant who was asked to round up some people in a neighborhood in 42, you would have a heck of a problem there doing that. So I want to say one other story that the audience in Milburn might appreciate, and that's that in an automobile in 1974 in the spring on the way up to Capitol Hill, the Secretary of Defense asked the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs the very question of what would happen if the President ordered a brigade commander or some other commander to come to his defense, did it directly to that commander, and ordered that commander not to consult anyone else. And would that be possible? And the Admiral, I forget his name now, who was chairman in 1974, turned to his legal advisor who told me the story, Colonel Stockdale, and he said, well, what about that, Zane? And Zane didn't say anything there. The Admiral reassured the Secretary of Defense that it couldn't happen. And when they got up to Capitol Hill, Colonel Finkelstein pushed the Admiral into one of these doorways that's recessed, and looked at the Admiral and said, you know darn well that could happen. It very well could. And the Admiral, in his sweet Southern accent, said to Colonel Finkelstein, well, Zane, don't you think they'd at least call us up?
Yes, question.
Major Mark Koppelman, U.S. Army. Dr. Kohn was obviously fairly critical of Colonel Milburn's writing. Took the time to read us verbatim the first 4 sentences of his article. In particular, the third sentence. And if he's critical of the verbiage that the Colonel used or chose to use, the Colonel was pretty clear in the military's role in the execution of policy. It wasn't in the formulation of policy, it wasn't in the dissension of policy or the changing of policy or the modification of policy. And then when Dr. Kohn uses the example of Sir General Jackson, I think that's also an interesting example to pull up, because in Dr. Kohn's rebuttal that was on the Foreign Policy website, he specifically criticizes Colonel Milburn for not differentiating the difference between orders from civilians and orders from military superiors. So by Sir General Jackson disobeying an order from General Clark, he's not straying into policy. If it were an order from a civilian, that's when you'd cross that borderline into policy. So I think the criticism is somewhat a little bit off. And then the question I have for Colonel Milburn is, and Dr. Cook, you brought this up yesterday in the definition of a profession. The Colonel brought it up again today, that a profession is self-regulating. So I'm curious as to, sir, if you could comment on and by the way, thank you for taking the time to write this paper. Thank you for publishing it as well and starting this conversation. But in the research that you put into this paper, what did you find as far as the military's self-regulation of our own civil-military relations? what feedback have you received since your article was published, especially from any general or flag officers, because it seems like most of the criticism is coming from outside the profession and not from within our own self-regulation. Thanks.
Yeah, that's.
Did you hear any of that?
Yes, I heard it all. Thanks, Martin.
Okay, great.
Great couple of questions. Just to paraphrase, you're talking specifically about self-regulation, and you wanted to know if in the aftermath of this article, I'd had any discussions about how is the military going to self-regulate as a profession. Is that correct? And then you asked about what was the reaction of flag-level officers to the article. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
The first part, self-regulation, we were just having part of this discussion upstairs at lunch, and I think, I think it is very important. I'll tell you why. Because, as I said, when I was at McWar, it was a common refrain that, yes, I would, when we're having these discussions, I would disobey an order if it was immoral. And to include a couple of flag officers who visited us and were asked that question. When asked specifically, what do you mean by an immoral order? No two answers were the same, So I think it bears definition. It's hard to define. That's what I've tried to do, and it's not in black and white. But I think it definitely needs to be part of our intermediate level schools and our higher level schools. We do kind of scratch the surface, but I think it's a little inconclusive. We talk about the military as a profession, but I walked out of, and I can't speak for the Naval War College. I know you've got an excellent program here. But I walked out of McWar not feeling really none the wiser about what the military profession is, how it is self-regulated. And none of the talks from our flag level officers, to be honest with you, really enlightened me. As far as reaction of flag level officers, I actually very surprised that, with no exceptions, very supportive. And I don't, I know this is for attribution, and so I'm not going to mention names, but fortunately, while all this was going on, as I mentioned, and I was beginning to feel the heat a little bit, I received an email from a retired Marine officer who forwarded an email from the commandant, and which, as you can imagine, was fairly comforting. But, having said that, too, I did have faith in the system. I mean, it wasn't as though I wrote something on the side. I mean, it went through McWar. McWar submitted it for a competition, and it was submitted to JFQ, and JFQ decided to publish it. Does that answer your question?
One question, Andrew, about this is sort of a philosopher question, but you talked a little about the subjectivity of ethics. Especially in the Middle Ages, there was a big discussion about this, mostly in the Catholic Church, about what was the moral status of a person's conscience, something that a person sincerely believes to be right or wrong. And the schoolmen took an interesting view of this. They said, well, it doesn't really matter whether your conscience's judgment is right or wrong. You should follow it in all cases regardless, because even an erring conscience should be followed, because to not follow it would be to intend to do something that you believe to be wrong, even if your belief is in fact mistaken. Okay, follow me so far? Okay, so a couple of examples. We had an Air Force JAG officer here last year. She'll be here again in the spring. She gives a great talk, mostly on questions of religion in the military, but she gave an example of a Air Force co-pilot who is, I believe, a devout Catholic, a conservative Catholic, who refused to take orders from the female pilot of the airplane because he had religiously inspired beliefs that women should not be ordering men to do things, in a particular airplane. And this almost resulted in an aircraft mishap. I called her to ask her about this because I was writing a paper in which I wanted to cite it. It turned out it never was a legal case. It was handled as a disciplinary matter, so there's no paper record. But she assured me, no kidding, it really happened, right? Another similar example was, again, from the Air Force, of male pilots, mostly of a very religious sort, of various kinds of Christianity, who refused to serve in missile silos with female officers. Now, and I think they would say to you that this is not an illegal order, but in my opinion, it's immoral. Care to comment?
Yeah, it's the most extraordinary example. You know, arguably too, you know, you could apply that to don't ask, don't tell. I mean,
I was trying to avoid that subject, but yes.
Yeah, and I don't, I desperately want to try and avoid talking about that specific topic. So, you know, as a philosophy major, and I'm used to these kind of masturbatory conversations, but I think there has to be, I'm allowed to say that. But I think the answer is that, yes, again, there are no clear-cut rules, but there's the reasonable man approach. You know, same thing with when I was talking about consequences. Consequences of actions, irreparable damage to national subordinates with results that are not justified by those consequences. Again, you have to kind of take a reasonable man approach. You're not giving, so you don't give license to someone to make that sort of case. The second part of it, the safeguard again, comes back to self-regulation of the profession. You know, if you allow someone to use that reason to circumvent, and it's clearly, I mean, hey, I'm not sure how he would justify that as how he would justify it as an immoral order, or
well, he would say these are just my deeply held personal religious convictions, and I'm willing to serve, but the service should accommodate me.
But we already have parameters on that. For instance, someone who's joined the military can't subsequently decide to be a conscientious objector. So I'm not telling you that morality is not subjective. I'm saying that yes, it is. There is an element of subjectivity, but there's also some common sense.
But I do think that the point I made about the erring conscience is not really just an abstract philosophical conversation. I'll just put it that way. But I think it's a very important. It's a real-world situation. I feel very strongly about the rightness or wrongness of this thing. If I'm sufficiently philosophical, I realize that other people view it differently, and I could, in fact, be mistaken. But here today, this is what I sincerely believe.
Martin, could I make a comment here?
Yeah, please.
The
voice of God.
I quoted earlier in response to a question, Article 90 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice that says you can't use dictates of conscience to refuse a legal order from a superior. And this relates directly to the idea of a self-regulating profession. This is a profession that exists under law, under the control of elected officials. The Uniform Code of Military Justice is passed in law by the Congress. The first version was passed in 1775. And so I think that this is, to some degree, has to be left in the hands of the lawyers because it's part of the law. I do have a comment to an earlier question that I didn't get a chance to reply to about the execution of policy. But I'll leave that when you say I can respond to it.
Go right ahead, Dick. Go ahead.
Well, I did read a sentence in Colonel Milburn's article about the execution of policy, but a great deal of his article relates to the advisory role of officers, and particularly the most senior military officers. And it seems to me that it's not just the execution of policy that's under discussion here. It's the obligation of senior military people to advise, to insist upon advice, even if they're not asked. Particularly if they do disagree on what's about to go down by the government. And I think it's there that they are advising in issues that are policy. But once the policy is decided, I think their situation is very much determined. And I think that Colonel Milburn's earlier distinction between the intentions of undoing policy and the results of a refusal to obey having some kind of collateral damage on a policy is a false distinction. I think it's really nonsensical, because once an officer at the most senior level does that, they are really interfering in policy no matter what they think they're doing. We know, and in fact, I cited a number of historical examples in which this has been going on. It actually has gone on all the way back to the beginning of the Republic, and certainly has been the case in the last 30 years.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Brian Durant, just to address...
Try your mic if you could, please, Brian. Just, really? Okay.
Okay, there is one here. Yes, sir. This one doesn't work either.
Good effort.
Your point earlier about the person saying, well, I can't do it because of religious grounds. When something is that self-serving, I think it really goes against the reasonable man complex, the reasonable man application. If it is that self-serving, then no.
In what sense is it self-serving? I'm not sure I understand that.
Well, I can't work for a woman. Well, that really doesn't do anything but uphold your own personal morals and needs. If it affects the institution, if it affects the nation, and then you have a moral disagreement, then yeah, I think you can go ahead and go forward with that. But if it is just for your own self-service, I don't think that anyone would really appreciate it.
Well, the suggestion is if there were religious objections, for example, of the sorts of the examples I gave, those are, in some sense, the term is self-serving, but yeah, I think you mean private. But yeah, let me give you an example. This was really an eye-opener to me. When I was at the Air Force Academy, we did a survey of cadets because there were issues you might have read in the paper about the treatment of women at the Air Force Academy. And so they did a survey, anonymous, of all the cadets. One of the questions was, I believe that women should serve in the U.S. military, and it was agree, disagree. One of those Likert scale, you know, strongly agree. And the strongly disagree number was quite large indeed, and to the alarm of the leadership. So I was just mentioning this with cadets one day in class, and afterward, one of my very favorite cadets, who happened to be a Mormon, LDS, came up and said to me, "Sir, I'd like to talk to you for a minute." I said, "Sure." He said, "I need to tell you, I answered strongly disagree on that question. Not because I won't serve with women and I won't take their orders, but if you ask me, what do I really believe, right? And for that matter, what does my church teach? It is that the role of women in society is different than that. So I'm not in any way interfering with my willingness and ability to serve. I understand what the policy is. But if you ask me directly what I think and feel, I'm giving you the honest answer." And that was I thought that was an eye-opening thing for me. It also led me to say you can't infer very much from that data, right? Because the reasons for it could be quite various.
Right, sir, but by the same token, you can't very well say, I refuse to do that on moral grounds, because that's serving only one person, yourself, not the institution.
Well, this is the issue that I think Colonel Milburn forces us to talk about, right? Because as I started, I think that in fact by voluntarily agreeing to serve in the military, assuming that you're not completely ignorant of what the deal is when you voluntarily agree to do it, you have given up a very large fraction, if not all, of your moral autonomy, right? Setting aside the illegal order problem, right? And by the way, just an aside about illegal orders. I have a friend, Mark Ociel, who wrote a really fine book called Obeying Orders, which I commend you. He's a professor of law, in which he points out that although we say that military personnel are supposed to obey only legal orders and should disobey illegal orders, and they should know the difference, we do precious little to actually prepare them to know the difference. So maybe we should be more attentive to that if we wanted to, and then the book drills into how would you do that in a way that wouldn't undermine good order and discipline, but would actively encourage people to recognize illegal orders when they see them. Anyway, that's an aside, right? But if we set aside the illegal order problem, which at least theoretically is not a problem, right? Because we expect you to disobey those, right? In theory, okay? So now we're talking about a sphere of legal orders that you have moral problems with, right? Dick's position is your morality is parked at the door. If the order is a legal order, we're done. You either execute it, or at your first opportunity, you get out. Do I understand you correctly, Dick?
Yes, you do. But I also think you have an obligation to explain to the giver of the order what the problem is, and let them take that under advisement. But
Okay.
essentially,
Good. Now, on the other scale, if I understand Colonel Milburn's position, is a sincerely held moral belief would be a sufficient reason to disobey even a legal order.
That has to be justified in terms of the institution subordinates nation.
Ah, that's an important qualification. So that would rule out my pilot, my example, my Air Force example.
That would rule out your example, which nevertheless was a good one, but it would, but not potentially the other one that you were trying not to avoid. I mean, potentially.
Well, right. So you're saying, I mean, that's the reason I mentioned 7 days in May at the very beginning, because these officers sincerely believe that if the president is allowed, now, of course, this breaks the constitutional problem, so you're not advocating
But
that.
those guys did more than dissent and retire.
They did.
They staged a coup.
They
I mean, that's
almost staged a coup, right?
But that's not what I'm advocating.
Right. But I mean, one kind of wonders why not. You know, if you got to the point that those officers in that fictional scenario got to, they believe the survival of the country will be fundamentally undermined if the president follows through with this.
No,
And we alone are in possession of the information to know this. We could follow constitutional processes to the grave, or we could make it stop, right? I mean, I deliberately picked another outer extreme. It's a fictional one, but you know, you don't want to say that because that violates the Constitution, right? But you do want to say perfectly constitutionally valid processes which have generated a legal order are something you feel empowered to disobey. So it seems to me it's a short distance from disobeying constitutionally valid processes to why not go all the way? I'd say when I think the survival of the country is at stake, I can imagine a scenario where the Constitution itself would have to be challenged.
First of all, it gets back again, and I'm sorry to keep going back to it, but it gets back again. You have to justify things in terms of the institution. And I probably should have, you know, the term reasonable man is
That's hard to find those guys, you know.
Yeah, but it's not far-fetched to use in this. Second thing is, no, I think there's a huge gulf between what I'm saying, which is dissent, resign, take the consequences, and staging a coup. You know, I'm certainly not going to.
Well, let me just press you on the resignation versus retire question, right? Because I think you mixed them up in your presentation. But are you saying no kidding resign? Like, you know, here's my rank on the table. I'm out of here.
I am, but here's a couple of things about that too. There are conceivably circumstances where it would be better to resign privately or not say publicly why you're resigning. There's also, you know, again, this explains again why it's not clear cut. What about your duty to your subordinates? Are you going to do better by them by staying in, or because you know the guy who's going to replace you is an incompetent buffoon,
right.
or you simply want to share their fate with them, or do you try and avert that fate by resigning publicly? Mm-hmm. You know, these are not. They're not easy arguments, but they're all arguments that came up, for instance, during the so-called revolt of the generals.
Right. Don Snyder, for example, was very critical of Army Generals Eaton and Batiste, who were two of the six, on the grounds that they had just come out of command. And then they do this retirement, and the question he raised, well, what do your subordinates think? They were working for you 6 months ago, and now we find out you didn't believe in the mission in the first place.
And the criticism of them, too, and I'm just quoting, the criticism was that they hadn't said anything at the time, that they'd had the opportunity but hadn't said anything.
Right.
Again, I'm not saying that didn't happen. I'm saying that was the criticism leveled against them.
Right.
Which is a different situation than what I'm talking about.
Okay.
But
Mark?
conceivably.
Yes, Dick, go ahead, weigh in.
It's a very interesting conversation, and I'd like to ask Colonel Milburn, when he cites, you know, the institution has to be at stake, why he would elevate the institution of the military above the Constitution or above the oath that officers take to support and defend the Constitution. Why is the institution more important?
I don't see, I don't understand exactly what the conflict is you're presenting. I'm saying, yes, we take an oath to the Constitution. You're saying we're violating that if we choose to resign, dissent, then resign because we see imminent harm to subordinates, for instance, not justified by the likely outcome.
No, you misinterpret what I'm saying. In response to the distinction between, a pilot who refuses to serve under a female aircraft commander, no, it has to be much. You in effect said no, it has to be much bigger. It has to be the institution at stake. And so what I'm wondering is why the institution at stake justifies disobeying a legal order and in effect violating the oath and undermining the Constitution.
No, I sort of, I'm not being deliberately opaque. I don't see why you're undermining the Constitution.
By refusing
if you're doing it simply because as we said you don't agree with the order on some other grounds, by no means no.
But by refusing to execute an order of the president, by refusing to execute an order as a commander of your combatant commander, you're certainly, it seems to me, disobeying the law, the UCMJ. And if you are thinking about, we're talking about things kind of right below the level of an attempted coup. I was relieved to hear you say you didn't really believe in doing that, but one level below, you seem to be saying, you would oppose a decision.
Can you say again, in order to kill the president or a combatant commander? Is that what you were talking about?
No. Here we are being badly served by Skype and by our technology. An order that the president gives you that you disobey, that you oppose.
I'm reminded here, forgive me for going all philosophical on you, but in Plato's dialogue, the Crito, which is this story about after he's been convicted in Athens and his friends are encouraging him to run away. They're going to get him out of Athens in the dark of night. They've got a plan. Say this is an unjust decision anyway. It was a kangaroo court. This is unfair. This is a bad order that you be executed. You certainly have no reason to stay here and let the state kill you, and we have an alternative. We can get you out of here. He makes this very interesting argument. Says, no, I've benefited from growing up under the laws of Athens all my life. I've respected the city. If I were to run away, I would, in my own small way, be undermining respect for the laws of Athens, even though in this case the laws are bad. I think Dick's argument kind of boils down to Crito, right?
But what you're talking about, again, is something very self-serving. If he ran away, what's the rationale for doing that?
Well, remember, he believes he's on a mission from God, literally.
Okay, well, we're back to the reasonable man theory. No, but here, the thing is that, yes, we can sit here all day, and I'm not trying to dismiss the arguments, but we can sit here all day and say, well, what if, what if just like for the, the instance, the example with Marshall opposing North Africa. But that's not, I'm not talking about the extremes, the things that are obviously absurd. And so you can either deny that there is nuance in this and say, no, you need to codify it because otherwise you're going to get these absurd examples. Or you can say, hey, there is some subtlety and nuance built into the decisions we make every day in our profession.
I certainly agree with that. But I think if I could restate Dick's point, as I understand it, respect for the Constitution in practice means obedience to constitutionally derived results. So it often happens that the Supreme Court rules in a way I think is mistaken, or more than at least half the time we elect a president I'd rather we didn't have, right? But there's no doubt in my mind that except in a couple of cases we could discuss, that these are constitutionally valid outcomes. and therefore I have to respect them, right? For me to continue to fight, as it were, the fight after the constitutionally appropriate process has played its way out would be, in my own small way, undermining the whole system of constitutional government. That's the Socrates argument, right?
Yeah.
So I guess, if I understand Dick correctly, saying if every officer arrogates to him or herself the moral authority to disobey legal orders, that's exactly analogous to what I just said. Is that a fair statement of your view, Dick?
Yes, it is, Martin.
But we're not talking about every officer abrogating to him or herself. And it gets back again to self-regulation. It gets back again to reasonable man theory. You know, the examples that I used, I don't think are absurd.
Okay, let's talk about reasonable man for a little bit for them, okay? Yeah. This is a standard borrowed from law. It says, what would a similar person similarly situated do, right? There's a general reasonable person standard for the society at large, and then within professions, there's a more narrowly specified kind of reasonable person standard. So I gave the example yesterday. Suppose a physician has performed a surgery that has a bad outcome, and there's a malpractice trial. This will turn into a parade of expert witnesses, some of whom will say a reasonable surgeon similarly situated would have done or could have at least considered doing what this person did, and other people will say no, right? That'll be the argument. So you're saying, if we take that as an example, you're saying if you as an officer decide to disobey a legal order, you would be appealing to a professional consensus of fellow officers in the belief that other officers similarly situated would have made a similar decision, or would at least see it as a reasonable decision.
And I understand that. That sounds clear, but yes, there has to be some kind of reasonable man, professional standard. Otherwise, we get these ridiculous examples. And there's something else, too. There's a check on this. I've never for a moment said that you should be able to do this and not take the consequences.
I understand that.
You know, so the consequences may include facing being charged under the UCMJ. That doesn't remove your obligation. The consequences may include retirement, resignation, loss of benefits, whatever it may be. You may not even be right. You may be proven to have been wrong.
That's my point about the conscience thing, right? Yeah.
So,
Art, could I make a point here too? And that is that the personal consequences to the officer doing this, it seems to me, are inconsequential compared to the political consequences that might occur to the nation under all sorts of circumstances, and indeed the consequences to the whole system of civilian control. I think that Colonel Milburn does not really consider in his article or in any of the discussion we've had to this point in time in the auditorium the implications for civil-military relations of one or more instances of this occurring. That is why I went to General Fogelman and said that he had to speak of what he did and how he did it and why he did it. Because some of the things I was hearing, particularly from a four-star officer who said to me, well, we don't have to put up with this stuff from the civilians, we can resign. And I said to him, I don't think you can at your level. He was then a member of the Joint Chiefs. And so we have to consider the consequences on the historical trajectory of what would happen if we had one or more instances of this. And I've made the point on the blog, Rich's blog, that if several chiefs do this at once, you have a military revolt on your hands.
Do you really believe that? Do you think resignation of one or two 4 stars is going to bring the whole edifice crashing down and cause the loss of civilian control?
40 years ago, Colonel Milburn, I wrote an article about the only barely documented attempt at a coup by a sizable amount of the American Army. And I made the point that had that occurred in 1783 at the beginning, I've heard officers make the point that describing this incident, that had it occurred at the formation of the United States, it would have had consequences for our military system and relationship that would reverberate for generations. The same way that the beheading of Charles I in 1642 had consequences for civil military relations in that last all the way up to today. These kinds of precedents are cited and studied, and the actions of individuals, particularly in high places, critical times of great importance, have consequences for countries. And I really do believe them. I can't predict what they are. I too, contrary to your and other belief, do believe that there are nuances here. I, however, think that some nuances can be awfully dangerous.
A couple of more questions from the audience. There was one down here, and then I saw a hand back here, and we'll move over this way.
I was just going to ask Dr. Cohen how the situation in Egypt would support or negate his position with respect to the president, the head of state, ordering the military to defend or to open fire or to use of force, and the actual military deciding not to have his back. What would you do in that situation? And how does that support your position, either of you?
Well, I think that's a very poor comparison, because since 1952 you've had a military government in Egypt. First Nasser and then Sadat and now Mubarak were generals. They took over the government. They that made, not and if they'd ordered the military to do what you say, I don't think anyone would have been greatly surprised, even though it's a conscript army. We have a very different system in this country with different origins and different legitimacy. The problem for President Mubarak is that his whole regime is lacking a certain fundamental way in legitimacy, and that's why people have risen up as it did.
But I think at the basic level, even though you say the legitimacy is not there, the order is still a legal order. Whether the use of force or the method is correct or incorrect, that's for the person on the ground to decide. And so, understanding this is not a U.S. example, I got that, but the basic principle of the choice the officer on the ground must make with respect to that order, how would you answer that?
Well, you're asking me to think like an Egyptian officer at this moment in time, and we know that military institutions are the product of their cultures and they reflect their cultures. I simply can't answer your question. Would it be an illegal order to fire or disperse the crowd? I don't think it probably would be under their constitution, legitimate or not, any more than the order at Tiananmen Square in 1990 was an illegitimate order, nor was the order to disperse the bonus marchers from President Hoover in 1932 to disperse those bonus marchers in Washington, D.C., although there's some dispute over whether they were really ordered to have the American cavalry run these people down and then go burn the camp at Anacostia. I can't. I'm just kind of having trouble dealing with the Egyptian case.
Thank you. Was there a question at the back? Yes, sir.
Edward Berry, Navy. We'll come back to the United States. I apologize, I'm not a pilot, and I don't remember some of the historical facts for this, but the Highway of Death in 1991, I was 11 at the time, so again, forgive me. The policy of the United States was to remove the Iraqi force from Kuwait, drive them back into Iraq, and the Secretary of Defense made it very clear. It was spoofed in an SNL, but we're going to cut them off and we're going to kill them. And it was pretty clear what the United States' intent and policy was in regards to the Iraqi army. So the Air Force pilots are flying over. The Iraqi army goes into full-bore retreat. They're stealing cars from the civilians and driving off. And the first time around, the pilots say, to their superiors, hey, this isn't right, we shouldn't be killing them. And I think that Dr. Kohn would say that's their moral obligation. And then the order came back down that says, continue what you're doing. And then that's, according to Dr. Kohn, would be the end of the discussion. The institutional hazard is, this is an army in full flight retreat, and we're still attacking it, which brings the question of war crimes, which is a hazard to the institution as a whole. And the obligation was for the pilots to come back and say, no, seriously, we need to stop attacking this army in retreat. And the superiors then gave the order and called off the attack, and they came back. Dr. Kohn would argue that we should have gone forward with the war crimes, and Colonel Milburn is saying that we don't continue with the war crimes, and I would just like Dr. Kohn's comments on that.
Before we do that, Dick, if you do mind a minute, my first published article in military ethics was on that event, by the way, and I happened to be teaching at the Air Force Academy during that war. So, a couple of things that you said just factually need a little correction. I wasn't 12. A couple of points about this. First of all, most of that attack was not being ordered from anywhere. In fact, one of the reasons that the Air Force pilots that I wrote the article with were troubled by that event is because all command and control of air assets was lost. It was actually a very dangerous engagement from an air point of view because especially the A-10 pilots who felt that they weren't getting any respect thought this was a great opportunity to show off the capabilities of A-10s. And so all air tasking orders went out the window, and it just turned into what they called a feeding frenzy at the time. Actually, once higher headquarters got a view of it, it was immediately ordered to stop. Cole and Powell saw the pictures, and that was where the decision was made that we need to terminate the war. I mean, you know, the American people are not going to sit still for these kind of pictures coming back. So now, the one other piece of it is I don't agree that it was a war crime. In fact, that was the burden of the article that we wrote. You could argue that this is a retreating, fleeing force, and therefore you've accomplished your strategic goal. And in some sense, that's clearly true. But as you say, most of those vehicles were actually stolen, civilian vehicles full of stolen stuff. And what they were not was a surrendered force. I mean, the way you get people to stop shooting at you in the laws of war is to surrender, right? Which means you put up your hands and you stay in place. And this was not a surrendered force. So there were a few white flags scattered around. You know, there might have been panicked individuals and so forth trying to retreat. But it was a legitimate act of war, perhaps unwise, maybe disproportionate. We could argue about that. But these were not surrendered forces. So there's that. Dick, did you want to comment on that? The question was directed to you, but sorry, I couldn't resist.
No, I think the clarification is really important, Martin. It was a political decision, not a humanitarian or a legal decision as far as I understand it, and you confirm it by General Powell. I do have a better example, but I don't want to take the time for it from the Vietnam War, but I'll give it to you as briefly as I can if you wish.
I think in the interest of time, Dick, maybe we ought to take one or two more questions. When are we supposed to quit, Tim?
2:45.
2:45? We've got a lot of hands up, so I think if you don't mind, Dick, we'll let Andy reply quickly, and then we'll move to more questions.
What I do want to say, though, that the example may have been modified beyond use, but it's a great topic to talk about because our whole language, the whole language of the law of war is replete with subjectivism. I mean, we use terms like imminent danger, hostile intent, even proportionality itself. All of these things require moral judgments. As I mentioned in my talk, the line between a legal order and an illegal order is seldom clearly defined. We are aided, I would say we have been, by it seems to be some kind of a policy or a reluctance to actually pursue those or prosecute cases that fall within that gray area. But it doesn't mean that those distinctions have to be made. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it certainly doesn't mean that you would not be justified in refusing an order where clearly, or not even clearly, where you felt that proportionality, the degree of response wasn't justified?
Those are not only nuanced and moral questions, those terms are also legal terms. I think any officer wants to think about what you said, Colonel Milburn, has to be prepared to have a very frank discussion with their lawyer, preparatory to a court of inquiry and perhaps a court-martial.
Yeah, thank you. I understand that. What I'm saying is that, yes, they're legal terms. I'm saying their interpretation on the ground, though, is often nuanced.
Okay.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Dr. Cook, and also this is for Dr. Kohn as well. You mentioned 7 days in May, and we've also discussed this trajectory at the current civil-military relations. And I would counter that, you're trying to draw the slope of the line that it's possibly infer that you're mentioning there's going to be some kind of cabal or push by the military writ large. And I would counter that there are mechanisms inherent in our society, whether it's that we have a free media that would report very accurately what was going on, and that you would also have the Second Amendment, which was something that our forefathers put in place to counter the danger of a standing army.
Could you repeat that one part?
Yes. He thought that you or I were suggesting that we were on a slope that would lead to some kind of military takeover of the government, and he also suggested that the Second Amendment possession of weapons by individual citizens was a break on military takeover or control of the government. And I think, Dick, I know your position well enough to state it for you, but I think I'll just let you do it.
Well, I don't. I think the citing of the Second Amendment is an invitation to civil war, and I don't. That was talked about in the ratification of the Constitution as the ultimate check upon a military government. But what I heard the questioner talk about was the possibility of a blow-up. I think that might be different than an attempted coup. The kind of blow-up that I think would worsen the suspicion and lack of trust between civil and military. And that's really the root of my great worry, is that we're at a situation now after 30 years, or at least 20 years, of real suspicion, tension, conflict, and most of all, distrust. And I think that successive chairmen of the Joint Chiefs have tried to restore the trust with mixed results. And so I'm real concerned about the education of officers in civil-military relations, because I think blow-ups have real bad consequences in their aftermaths. And I've always argued that this is all situational. It depends on the people, the issues involved. But this business of distrust has become so toxic, I think, that we're in some danger.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or perhaps two more questions, if there are any out there. Yes, Colonel.
Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Butch Brackman. I think the issue of the coup and the government takeover is kind of, but I think what we do need to be concerned about, if that's a strategic coup, I think what we do need to be worried about is something of a lesser variety, which you might term a tactical coup or something like that. Let's assume there was a country whose name ended in Stan, and that there were some political judgments made within that country that we needed to put more restrictive rules of engagement on tactical units in that country because of the concern of, say, civilian casualties or something silly like that. And that the strategic judgment was made that these civilian casualties were going to threaten the overall prosecution of the campaign at a strategic level, but that there was one battalion commander in an RC, say RC East or something like that, who felt a moral duty to resist those rules of engagement because of some strongly held moral belief in protecting his force, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then you had a small tactical coup that might have a strategic effect. So he then chooses to liberally interpret those rules of engagement in a way that continues to cause civilian casualties, and which then threatens the overall. So is there a question here? No, I don't know. But, what do you think about that? What do you think about the distinction between, our military is spread all over the world. We're not all packed in around the Capitol like in Cairo or something like that, where the idea of using the military against the legitimately constituted civilian government is a real issue. We're spread out all over the place. In fact, there is no combat power in Washington, D.C. Let me tell you, I work there. There's nothing. I'm it. So that's not the issue. The issue is this issue of tactical coups that then have strategic
Yeah.
effects.
Dick, if you couldn't hear that, the questioner asks about what he's calling tactical coups, that is, at the lower level, not necessarily following broader strategic guidance from higher headquarters because of a felt sense at the tactical level that those ROE, for example, are too restrictive or something like that. I think most of the examples that Dick has in mind are of that sort of thing, actually. You know, Peter Fever at UNC calls this, what does he call it, shirking, right?
Sure.
You know, it's not that you directly, and to Colonel Milburn's credit, I mean, he recommends, if you're going to do this flat out in the open, right? Don't just find a way to sort of not hear the comms, right? Or in some other way evade it. I mean, we have one real example of this at a very high strategic level coming out of Vietnam, and some more facts about this case have just come out very recently, namely General Lavelle's court-martial in Vietnam. You remember where he was keeping two sets of books, basically, on the bombing he was doing in Vietnam, and he was court-martialed for the belief that he was doing this on his own authority because he thought if he followed the White House's instructions, he was going to lose a lot of crews, and so in the interest of trying to protect crews, he was modifying the bombing missions, but reporting back to the White House that he was doing what they told him. And that, unbeknownst to him, got to be a big problem at the Paris Peace Conference because the North Vietnamese were saying, you're bombing X, Y, and Z, and Henry Kissinger was saying, no, we're not. I have the orders here. And so the North Vietnamese knew the real truth, and Secretary Kissinger did not. It turns out now that apparently we know that the White House knew a great deal more about what General Lavelle was doing, and he was hung out to dry.
Thank you.
He was, Martin, and at the time and since, and the historical record shows that General Lavelle thought, because of a wink and a nod from the Joint Chiefs, that he was carrying out what his superiors wanted done, and it was the keeping of the separate books and the way in which he carried out that exposed him apparently to great risk. It's still a controversial problem. And I think what the questioner is really raising, and I may be wrong about this, is really the larger problem of disobedience that in fact Colonel Milburn has raised, and it's disobedience of what I would call the slimy kind, which has become something of a bureaucratic practice in this country. The leaking, the slow rolling, the bureaucratic activity. Colonel Milburn would like to bring it out in the open, and as I said in the blog, he says we ought to be stand-up guys about it, say, hell no, we're not going to do that. And what my response is that the bureaucratic and the slimy disobedience, the part of it that's been going on for 40, 50, 60 years is bad enough. But if you really do have a confrontation with the constituted civilian authorities, you are going to create a much worse mess in this country than you've got now. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's fine to talk about this. I'm glad Colonel Milburn wrote about it, but the consequences of what he argues are really very dangerous.
Thank you. With that, I think we're at time. So I would thank each of you gentlemen for your participation. And thank you. We'll see you tomorrow morning.